Hello and welcome to another standard video. Today we're gonna push the limit, quite literally, with this new 7 mana sorcery, returning all mount and vehicle cards from our graveyard to the battlefield. We have to sacrifice those at the beginning of the next end step, but in the meantime all our vehicles become artifact creatures, so we don't need to crew them, and they also gain haste, so we can immediately attack with all of those, and in this deck that's often going to be enough to win the game on the spot, since we're playing 16 vehicles, and they all have cycling, which is perfect, since we can spend mana in the early turns, discarding them to put them in the graveyard while drawing additional cards, so we can find our interaction and eventually our push the limit, and that way our graveyard will be nice and full by the time we can cast it. And our vehicles include some 1 mana cyclers like the Ironclad and the Detention Chariot, which is a bit more exciting to bring back out of the graveyard, as it can also clear a blocker when it enters the battlefield, so our opponent won't be able to necessarily survive if they have some creatures back on defense. Then the Broodwagon is a bit more expensive to cycle, but is also more powerful if we get it back, destroying opposing non-land permanents with mana value 4 or less. And then Valor's Flagship cycles for X and 3, so we can cycle it for just 3 mana to discard and draw, but if we have additional mana we could also make some pilot tokens. Now Valor's Flagship is legendary, so we can only have one in play at the same time, but the stats also make up for it as a 7/7 with flying, first strike and lifelink. And then we also have the curve of turn 3 cycling Flagship, and turn 4 cast Tune Up to get our Flagship back out of the graveyard and turn it into a creature similar to Push the Limit, but we won't have to sacrifice it end of turn, so it can stick around and sometimes win the game by itself. And then the rest of our deck includes lots of board wipes to try and keep the board clear so we don't get overpowered by creature decks before we're ready to push the limit. And then I'm playing a mix of Split Up, which destroys all tapped creatures or all untapped creatures, since this can be a nice answer to the red deck curving into a Screaming Nemesis, which otherwise, if we try and deal damage to it with a Brotherhood's End, for instance, would deal damage to us, and then we cannot gain life with our Valor's Flagship anymore. But Brotherhood's End can be a nice answer to artifact decks as well, and then Lockdown can also be a nice answer to cheaper permanents sometimes. And then Ill-Timed Explosion is particularly synergistic here as a way to draw 2 cards sometimes, or draw 2 cards and put additional vehicles in the graveyard while dealing damage equal to the highest mana value of the discarded card. So that's another excellent way to keep the board clear while progressing our game plan. So that's why we're dipping into blue. And then the mana base is playing a nice mix of the Surveil lands, which let us surveil when they enter tapped, which are also perfect for filling the graveyard some more with additional vehicles and digging towards our combo pieces. And the Surveil lands have 2 basic land types, which means that if we have one of them in play, they will automatically enable all the other Verge lands in our deck, and there's 8 new of those, with the Sunbillow Verge in red-white, and the River Power Verge in blue-red, starting out with the red mana, which is actually better since we don't need blue mana until later when we need to cast our Ill-Timed Explosion. So starting out making red mana helps us cycle an Ironclad on turn 1, for instance, and then the Flood Farm Verge also starting with white mana. So this is actually set up perfectly for this particular deck, since we want a red and white early, which is what the Verge lands also produce in case we happen to draw multiples, and then later we just need a little bit of blue for our Ill-Timed Explosion. So yeah, that's our deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Okay, we're on the draw with a functional hand. Still missing a way to bring back our vehicles, but a Lockdown could be quite good against this opponent. And then Verge I'll keep, since we need to hit our lane drops. Alright, so definitely an artifact deck. Opponent will get to at least 3 speed. For now, play another Surveil land. Now I can maybe say no to a land since we already have 5. And then we'll be cycling the Chariot. Alright, so Aetherdrift hits pretty hard, but we'll still get rid of their clue token at least. But our opponent will get to discover. So needs double white. They could discover another Zoetic Glyph, which won't get to enchant anything. But they hit a nesting bot. So they will get to max speed here in a second, which will give this one additional power. Although we can once again wipe the board. Opponent passes with mana up, so I don't feel inclined to cast the explosion. Can just surveil and then cycle the flagship. Could have also kept up an extra mana. So we need 7 mana for push the limit, so I think I'll keep land. Would like to find a few more vehicles, since flagship is a legendary, so can only have 1. Could also just cycle flagship, making a few pilot tokens to block. And cycling flagship is not something our opponent can counter. Although now tune-up looks good as well. Get back flagship and make our opponent come up with an answer. And then don't need a land number 8 necessarily. Opponents got their own flagship, so they might have a similar game plan. It's gonna be Urza, alright. Pumping artifact creatures. So get to hit for 7. And then ill-timed explosion, dealing 4 to everything. Looks good here if we discard tune-up. Keep the Brotherhood's End. And then I can still surveil. And then next turn we could push the limits. I'll keep another explosion on top, but still a 4 mana draw too. Another Urza. And another nesting bot. Take 3. So we would be, I guess, only getting back 1 chariot, so push the limit isn't pushing too many limits right now. Instead we can just Brotherhood's End, deal 3 to everything. Or maybe cast the explosion first, and then we still have double red. Alright, so could deal 6 to everything. Which keeps our flagship. And I still have Brotherhood's End as a leftover. Don't need to cast it now. But now push the limit looks quite a bit better. Take 5. Opponent's still technically dead on board. But we may as well push the limit in case they had more interaction. Awesome, on to the next one. Okay, we're on the play with a functional hand. Cycle, destroy some creatures, and then perhaps tune up. Do I want another explosion? I don't think so. Need to hit our land drops first. Facing a red deck, although it might be goblins instead of typical mono red. So just gonna cycle here and hope that our 2 sweepers can buy us some time. Opponent probably thinks we're on just a Jeskai control deck. In which case Hordemaster is pretty good in the face of sweepers. But now they're gonna probably figure it out. Opponent does get to 2 speeds, which is relevant with the raceway. Yeah, I think it's already fine to cast the Brotherhood's End, keep their speed under control, and then we still have an explosion left for future plays. Nothing too exciting to tune up. I guess we could get back a Broodwagon to destroy something if needed. And a Scamp, what they found of Hordemaster. Hopefully our opponent's not on a build with Cauldron, which is synergistic with Krenko and some other goblins. And would be a way to, of course, also exile our vehicles. That's where holding a Brotherhood's End could have paid off. But nope, just some regular goblins. And now a Lockdown looks like a fine play alongside cycling an Ironclad. Keep Explosion as an answer to Krenko and the more expensive goblins. Opponent is at 3 speed, so Raceway is almost online. And we're hoping for something like a Valor's Flagship. And there's a Howl Squad Heavy, so that will get them to max speed now. Can potentially take a hit from Krenko if they activate it just to one time. So I don't think we cast the explosion yet, even though it's tempting. And let's just cycle the Broodwagon after surveilling. Brotherhood's End cannot be bad. Is that a reason to cast the explosion now? Maybe it is. Although I'll have to discard. I guess Broodwagon we don't mind as much. Could also tune up, get back the Broodwagon, deal with a heavy, and then still have sweepers left over. Sure. Maybe that's a little safer, because Howl Squad tapping for mana could also allow them to chain together multiple spells. 4 mana, do we see Krenko? So we currently have 1 vehicle in graveyard, but still at a relatively healthy life total. Engineer can eventually make a 4/4 dragon token. Still no great attack. The hesitation makes me think they might have a Witchstalker Frenzy in hand, and they didn't quite have enough mana to cast it. I guess we could Brotherhood's End and then attack, even though it feels like a little bit of a waste. I guess I can attack first, and if they want to double block, that's fine by me. Yeah, maybe I'll cycle the Broodwagon first, and then see what we pick up, and decide from there. Alright, push the limits. So, want to try and set that up, which maybe involves casting the explosion. And then next turn, if I get 3 vehicles back, that could be lethal, even if I destroy my own Broodwagon here. Still need an extra land. And yeah, that could work. Discard, push the limits, and Broodwagon to wipe the entire board. Although, maybe that's not necessary, because I do still need to hit a land drop, but we're pretty likely to survive with a Brotherhood's End. Could also discard nothing at all, but this seems safe enough. So we wipe the board, opponent's at 14, so well within range of push the limits being lethal. And if we don't draw an untapped land, I can still Brotherhood's End, which likely keeps me alive for another turn or 2. There's Krenko, potentially with haste. Something we were definitely prepared for. But on an empty board, it's not too scary. And now we can just push the limits and win the game, destroying Krenko a few times in the process. Good game indeed. Yeah, the Goblin matchup seems reasonable. Our game plan of sweepers into win the game combo lines up quite favorably. Seems easier than facing the typical mono-red aggro deck with more burn spells. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw. We've got sweepers aplenty. And at least 1 vehicle to put in the graveyard, facing blue-white enchantments. Okay, so our sweepers should be effective. I'll keep a land. And our opponent's on, I guess, the Esper Pixie deck instead. So they might have some bounce spells to send my vehicles back to hand. But our sweepers are still going to be effective. So, pass a turn, cycle this end of turn. And then I prefer Brotherhood's End if their creatures are still in range, since lockdown is something they could bounce and give us problems later. Split up also works, so we have options. Is there any instant speed enchantments our opponent could play to grow Scavenger in this deck? I guess Nowhere to Run, but that's still only 1/1 counter, so that's not quite enough. So I think we Brotherhood's End now, so Split Up can maybe deal with larger creatures later. Don't think this deck typically plays Shard Mage's Rescue, so that works. A Nightmare makes me discard. So if I lock down the Nightmare, they cannot bounce it, but they could of course bounce Lockdown, getting Nightmare back. So yeah, I think a Lockdown is awkward enough that I'll get rid of it. And then I could always cast Explosion just as a draw 2, which I don't hate. Although I could just discard my vehicles, so I don't have to spend time cycling them. Upside of keeping them in hand is if they play more Nightmares, I'll have stuff to discard. So maybe it's fine to keep them in hand, actually. Scavenger, that's okay. And then maybe Pixie, pick up Nightmare, replay it. It's gonna be a lab returning their creature. Don't usually see that card in the Pixie decks. Would have been a reason to maybe a Lockdown earlier, but I think we'll manage. So now I guess we'll go for another Explosion, maybe playing a Surveil land first. Alright, I'll keep the tune-up in hand. And then discard my 2 vehicles. Sure. And then tune-up can decide between Broodwagon or Flagship. Opponent passes. So yeah, if I get back the Flagship, what likely happens is their opponent bounces it with this town ain't big enough, returning their Nightmare, or maybe their Room. If I try and destroy one of their things with a Broodwagon, the same thing will kind of happen, so I'm unlikely to destroy anything. So maybe we wait for them to tap out, and then for now I can just keep cycling, which I don't mind. And look for our 7 mana, push the limit. A land 7 I'll eventually need if I want to push the limit, but I'm likely to draw into a land naturally here with all the cycling. So I'll pass it back. Opponent will indeed bounce their own 2 permanents back, so that also works. Return a creature back. Yeah, if they had an actual Pixie or Fear of Isolation, this would have been scarier with a Nightmare draining us for 2 each time. Opponent keeps up 1 mana, but that doesn't really represent anything meaningful. Could of course also just cast a Chariot for 6, but we should have better ways to spend our mana. Alright, there we go, push the limits, and I can cast it. So is that game over here? We've got triple Broodwagon, Flagship, Chariot, that should suffice. Destroy your Scavenger and your Lab. I'll destroy your Lab twice. And attack. Alright, sweet. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the play with what looks like a Keeper. We get to Surveil, Cycle, Set Up, Tune Up, although I don't really want to get back just an Ironclad. And Split Up, missing double whites. I want land 4 for Explosion and more vehicles, so I think we can ditch it. Although if our opponent's a mono-red aggro, Split Up is one of our best answers to a Screaming Nemesis. So I might end up regretting it. I think I cycle main phase, because I might draw another tap land. Alright, they're split up, so we can still have access to it. For now, Lockdown seems fine, so we don't take damage off Hero. And keep split up for Nemesis. So if we could get back a Valor's Flagship here with a tune-up, that's our best way to beat the red deck. Black means they're on the Pump Spell version with Sellsword. And once again, we're gonna a Lockdown, or we could cast the Explosion, I suppose, to dig a bit deeper. and only take 1 damage of Heartfire Hero. And then double Chariot can go. So we drew lots of our sweepers. Tune up, getting back Chariot, also an answer to Screaming Nemesis, but this build might not be playing it since they're more focused on pump spells, which we haven't seen so far, but there we go. At least they cannot cast a Slick Shot here. And a Scamp. Alright, so our points on empty. We can once again wipe the board, and we've got to push the limits as our win condition as well. So I think we go for another Explosion, just to hit our land drop for a turn. Discard Broodwagon, and it's possible push the limit is ambitious, and I can just get there with tune-up on something. Yeah, it's a close call, because Lockdown and Split Up still have their uses. I'll keep the Split Up. And then Mountain I can keep in hand. So if we draw another land, we can push the limits. Scamp is fine. So I can tune up. And then this can destroy it. This will exile their creature, so we don't take damage. Yeah, I'll go with a 6/6. And then we should have enough vehicles where push the limit just wins the game. That's gonna have to wait a turn. Alright, I guess tune up, get back. Can go for another 6-powered creature. Although I'm still gonna be 1 short of lethal next turn. Opponent draws a land. And yeah, I was gonna have to cycle the Ironclad, but we should get there in 2 turns. Sweet, on to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw. We've got our Split Up for aggro, tune up, and push the limit, just missing the actual vehicles. But at least with 2 Surveil lands, we get a few looks. And turn 1 Nesting Bot, so another artifact deck. Thundering Falls, probably better than an average draw, since we do need to get to 7 mana, and at least we get to Surveil. Well, we've seen this start before. Split Up not quite as good as a Lockdown would be, or a Brotherhood's End in this spot. Now I can probably ditch the land. Another Nesting Bot. Opponent gets to 3 speed. Yeah, I guess we'll try Split Up. If that works. Still under a bit of pressure. And a Leyline Axe. At least they can't equip right away. And an Explosion. Alright, probably need to cast it. Found a vehicle at least. And a untapped land can go. So at the very least we could tune up, get back our Chariot next turn, which will exile their token for good. But first I want to Surveil in case I can find something better. Parlor, do we want to keep that? Yeah, it might be okay, since I can play it and then still cycle. And then our Broodwagon could eventually destroy the Leyline Axe. Opponent's a little short of animating Anchorage and equipping it. But they'll just get in for 2. And they could still explore, maybe picking up an extra +1 counter. So we will surveil. That I can just put in the graveyard, so I don't have to pay the 1 mana to cycle it. I'll cycle main phase. And then Brotherhood's End, I guess, doesn't quite solve our problem, but could be useful later. Alright, so if we push the limit next turn, we get back Ironclad and Broodwagon, so that's 12 more damage. That could be enough. Opponent can now equip the axe, so that's 6 damage. So yeah, if they hit a counter last turn, we might have died. But now we get to return the favor. Alright, so close one here against a blue-white artifact. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw. We've got Flagship, a couple more Cyclers and some removal. So just looking for a tune-up specifically. Facing another red deck, those aren't going anywhere. And actually top deck the tune-up. Do I need a second copy? I don't think so. Hitting our land drops is now important. Even though there is a chance our opponent can destroy our 7/7 if Witchdoctor Frenzy is involved. Manifold Mouse. So now we're actually secretly hoping our opponent curves out into a Screaming Nemesis, because I would split up to destroy all of them. And we'll just keep up our 2 1-mana Cyclers. Maybe I should cycle main phase just to tap my mana so they're not afraid of removal. But yeah, opponent's got the Nemesis. So on the draw, this is kind of the worst case scenario since our opponent had the perfect start, Heartfire into Manifold Mouse into Nemesis. We have the perfect answer, although we're still gonna take a boatload of damage here. So it's far from over. But at least we've got a chance now with Split Up. I guess I'll be at 3 since Heartfire Hero dies. But at least we're not damaging the Screaming Nemesis. And I actually don't have an untapped land for tune-up, although would still need to cycle the Flagship first anyway. So we're dead to another Screaming Nemesis or a Lightning Strike. Burst Lightning puts us to 1. And 2 of those is 4 damage. Our opponent did the math. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the play. We have only white mana at the moment until we find a Plains or Mountain. So we can cycle Chariots, and then pretty likely to be able to Brotherhood's End on 3. So this one's borderline. I think I would rather mulligan. Alright, this is a bit better. And then I'll keep my Cycler, Brotherhood's End. Seems fine. Facing blue-black. And the blue-black Pixie / Fear of Isolation deck. So, a winnable matchup, but we'll need to find one of our reanimation effects eventually. Actually reasonable to cycle the Chariot since I'm missing a second white source, so that's going to be a bottleneck. Whereas I can still cycle Broodwagon plus Chariot next turn. And ideally we just want to hit our land drops, and then tune-up is less likely to win the game than just going for our push the limits, since opponent will have some bounce spells to return a single creature. Fear of Isolation's fine, just returning a talent. So Brotherhood's End can still eventually clean those up. And then now we can cycle twice. So hoping they just play another talent. That's okay. They missed out on a prowess damage to keep their options open, perhaps. Possible they have this town ain't big enough in hand to bounce stuff back. So we could pull the trigger on Brotherhood's End, could wait. Now we've got an ill-timed explosion as well. Yeah, I guess we'll Brotherhood's End and then Surveil should buy us some time. Otherwise we risk taking a lot of damage next turn. That worked. And tune-up is probably okay to keep. Can at the very least destroy one of the opponent's permanents with our Brood Wagon. A Nightmare, discard, I think an untapped land. And Fear of Isolation to pick it up. Alright, that's more problematic than picking up a Stormchaser's Talent for sure. So now what? Feels bad to ditch the explosion, so I think I'm still just ditching a land. And then it's possible the correct place to destroy the Hopeless Nightmare before they can pick it up again, as opposed to the Fear of Isolation, which we can clean up with the explosion. Although they do get to scry 2 now. Playing my last land out means another Nightmare makes me discard the explosion, so yeah, tricky spot. Broodwagon does have reach at least, so it is good at blocking the Fear of Isolation. And then holding Broodwagon enables explosion, but that would also destroy my own Broodwagon. If they bounce this, then I get to cycle it anyway. So I think I'm fine just putting it in graveyard. So the game continues. Want to get to 7 mana. Ooh, opponents may have missed the reach. Alright, never mind. They want to finish off the Broodwagon. Still a trade I'm happy to make. We're just trying to buy time. Restless Reef. Somewhat scary, since I cannot interact with it at instant speed, but if it mills me, it also sets up more of my synergies. Now, I think I cast the explosion before I cycle Ironclad, since at the very least I'll have it to discard to deal with the Fear of Isolation. But we might just end up drawing 2 with it. Yeah, that seems reasonable, and then I can cycle, and then we're pretty close to push the limits, which would just win the game. Cycle first in case I draw a tap land. Alright, so we've got everything set up for next turn. A very full graveyard, so hopefully no more discard. Talent they could level up, but there's no this town ain't big enough to get back, nor the mana to cast it. Opponent's gonna fire up Restless Reef, so that's fine. And then now push the limit is easily going to be enough. Exile your Otter token 3 times. Destroy all your Otter permanents. And attack for well over 20 damage. This is also good for completing some of your achievements nowadays. Putting 5 creatures into play with haste to attack on the very same turn is one of them. Winning without casting a single creature spell is another achievement you can get with this deck as well. So yeah, can certainly recommend it for the current standard ladder, even though you will be at a disadvantage to most versions of mono-red aggro. That's going to be true for a lot of these slower decks that mostly try to control the board at sorcery speed. But yeah, still definitely a winnable matchup with a good enough draw. So that's going to do it for today's gameplay. Want to thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and as always, Have a nice day.